Picture Rome in 38 CE, the marbles still gleaming, the legions still marching, the Senate still speaking in thunder. From Britain to Mesopotamia, tribute pours in like a steady river. To the outside world, it looks unbreakable. But empires rarely crack from a single blow. They hairline first, from within. And on the Palatine Hill, a hairline is forming. A 15-year-old bride has just crossed the palace threshold, hailed as a cure for chaos, a promise of virtue after years of madness. Her name is Messalina. By daylight, she is every sculpted ideal the empire demands: noble blood, flawless poise, the perfect Matrona beside an aging emperor. But the most dangerous power in Rome isn't the sword, or the law, or the legion. It's a secret, kept, traded, weaponized. And she will learn to wield it with a precision the generals could only envy. This isn't a tale about lust, it's about leverage. About how shame can chain a senator more tightly than iron. About how a court can turn from policy to theater, and how the audience, governors, generals, envoys, leave not loyal, but compromised. It's the story of a woman who discovered that contradiction is a force of nature. The purer the public image, the more explosive the private risk. Tonight, we step behind the curtains of Rome's brightest stage to watch reputations balanced on a knife's edge, negotiations derailed by a single whispered memory, and a marriage that dares the empire to blink. Before barbarians ever touch the walls, something far more intimate rattles the foundation. This is how an empress turns humiliation into governance, and how a superpower learns that the costliest battlefield can be a palace garden at dawn. The year was 38 CE. Rome stood at its zenith, an empire of marble, blood, and ambition. The Senate buzzed with voices echoing under columns older than memory, and the legions, loyal and tireless, patrolled borders that stretched farther than any civilization had ever dared to dream. From Britannia's foggy cliffs to the deserts of Mesopotamia, the eagle of Rome cast its shadow on the world. Yet beneath that grandeur, the heart of the empire beat with unease. The emperor, Claudius, had ascended to power almost by accident. Scholars called him cautious, soldiers called him weak, and the aristocracy whispered that he was a man of intellect trapped in a body that betrayed him, awkward, stuttering, easily led. But Rome needed stability. After the violent reign of Caligula, the city was desperate for order, for purity, for a symbol that the gods had not abandoned them. That symbol arrived in the form of a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Valeria Messalina, a child of noble blood, raised among marble courtyards and polished tutors, taught to speak softly and walk with grace. When she was chosen to marry Claudius, the Senate erupted in applause. Priests declared the union blessed. The people rejoiced, believing this young bride would cleanse the stains left by tyranny. She was beauty personified, virtue reborn. At the wedding procession, citizens lined the Via Sacra tossing petals at her feet. They saw not a girl but a prophecy, a promise that Rome's moral spine would stiffen again. In their eyes, she was the perfect Roman woman, fertile, obedient, dignified. The Matrona Idealis. She would bear heirs, secure the dynasty, and stand as the embodiment of Roman virtue beside the emperor. Inside the palace, though, that illusion began to flicker. The marble floors were cold, the corridors silent. Claudius, more scholar than ruler, spent his nights surrounded by scrolls, debating history with slaves instead of senators. To Messalina, the palace did not feel like power, it felt like confinement. She was the empress of the world, yet her every step was measured, every word weighed. Every eye followed her, searching for flaws. In Rome, a woman's worth was defined by restraint. Desire was a weapon men could wield. For women, it was treason. Messalina quickly understood the trap laid before her. Her beauty had bought her a throne, but that throne was a cage. To survive, she needed something greater than charm. She needed control. At first, she played her role to perfection. At public ceremonies, she stood beside Claudius like a statue come to life. Her golden hair braided in intricate coils, her smile serene, her gestures studied. She bore 2 children quickly, a daughter named Octavia and a son, Britannicus, sealing her position in the imperial line. When she entered the amphitheater or the temple, citizens bowed, murmuring prayers for her long life. She had everything a Roman woman could dream of: beauty, power, motherhood, and honor. But perfection, to Messalina, became its own kind of torment. The rituals of respectability began to feel like chains. Each salute from the Senate, each bow from the priests, each whispered compliment, all of it reminded her that she was trapped inside an image. And images, no matter how divine, are lifeless things. She began to observe the world around her differently. When senators came to dinner, she noticed their tremors of fear beneath polite laughter. When generals boasted of loyalty, she saw the glint of calculation in their eyes. Rome was not ruled by law or virtue. It was ruled by fear and appearance. Those who survived longest were those who knew how to manipulate both. Messalina had a gift. She could read weakness. She could sense hesitation the way a wolf senses blood. It started innocently enough. A word of advice whispered in Claudius's ear about who could be trusted, who could not. But each suggestion earned her influence. Every time she was right, the emperor leaned on her a little more. Soon, her name began to appear in the margins of official decrees. Senators who had once mocked the young empress now bowed lower, uncertain whether their flattery was enough. In less than a year, the girl who had entered the palace as a symbol of innocence had become its most silent architect of power. And yet, something in her remained restless. Historians later wrote that Messalina was driven by lust, by a hunger for pleasure without limits. But perhaps the truth is subtler, more human. Perhaps she was driven by the desire to feel something real in a world where every gesture was rehearsed, every glance politicized. She lived among actors, the emperor, the senators, the priests, all performing their roles in the eternal play of Rome. Every smile was strategy, every vow conditional. Messalina began to wonder. If the entire empire was a performance, what would happen if she rewrote the script? In private moments, she studied her reflection in bronze mirrors polished to perfection. The face staring back was flawless, but behind the symmetry she saw something else, an intelligence that refused to stay silent. She began to test boundaries, small at first, subtle gestures that defied custom. A look held too long, a question asked too directly. The thrill was intoxicating, not because of rebellion itself, but because for once she felt alive. It was during these months that Messalina's worldview crystallized. She realized that Rome's strength, its rigid moral code, was also its greatest weakness. Every senator, every general, every noble family lived in terror of public shame. Reputation was the empire's heartbeat, and she now held her hand over its pulse. What if she could use that fear, not to destroy Rome, but to bend it, to make the empire's obsession with virtue serve her, not restrain her? And so began the quietest revolution in Roman history. No armies marched. No decrees were issued. It began with whispers, whispers that the empress was listening, that she knew who was faithful and who was not, that behind her gentle voice was the memory of every rumor, every secret, every weakness. Messalina was not yet a villain in the eyes of Rome. To the world, she remained the perfect wife, the mother of the imperial heir, the living emblem of Roman grace. But behind closed doors, she was already building something that would soon eclipse even the emperor himself. The courtiers didn't notice the shift right away. Power rarely announces itself with trumpets. It creeps, quietly, like ivy on a wall. Within 2 years, the vines had wrapped around every pillar of government. Governors were appointed not for competence, but for loyalty. Tribunes sought her favor before seeking the emperor's. The Senate began to measure its words, fearing what might reach her ears. Rome still looked invincible from the outside. But within the palace, a new axis of power had emerged. A teenage girl with a crown of gold and a mind as sharp as the blade that would one day end her. Messalina had become exactly what Rome had asked for, a symbol of virtue. But beneath that polished surface, she was something far more dangerous. She was learning that in an empire built on fear of disgrace, the person who controls shame controls everything. And she was only just beginning. Night fell differently over Rome. By day, the city shone like a marble crown, its streets alive with merchants, poets, and priests praising the empire's greatness. But when the sun disappeared behind the Palatine Hill, the light that gilded Rome's perfection peeled away, revealing its veins of desire, greed, and fear. It was in those hours that Messalina began to understand her true power. The palace was vast and silent at night, echoing with the faint rustle of servants' sandals and the whisper of the Tiber outside the walls. Messalina would walk through the corridors alone, fingertips brushing the cold stone, her reflection multiplying in polished bronze shields. Each time she saw her own image, she wondered which version of herself Rome adored and which one she was becoming. By daylight, she still played her part flawlessly. The citizens adored her, senators praised her restraint. Claudius, oblivious or willfully blind, found comfort in her composure. She bore herself with the serenity expected of an empress, offering the illusion of stability that Rome so desperately craved. But illusions, once tasted, can become intoxicating. The first cracks appeared not in the palace, but in the whispers drifting through the Subura, the city's underbelly. There, among the taverns and tenements, where soldiers drank and the poor traded rumors like coin, stories began to circulate. They said the empress sometimes vanished after dark, that a woman with golden hair and the bearing of a queen had been seen slipping into the maze of alleys, cloaked and veiled. At first, the rumors seemed absurd. An empress? In the streets at night? Impossible. And yet, Rome was a city addicted to gossip, and no story spread faster than one that threatened power. Messalina heard the whispers, and instead of silencing them, she listened. To her, these rumors were not danger, they were opportunity. They told her what Rome truly feared. Not violence, not invasion, but scandal. The empire could forgive bloodshed, it could not forgive shame. Some historians later claimed that Messalina disguised herself and entered the city's pleasure houses, seeking forbidden experiences. Perhaps, but whether the rumors were fact or fiction matters less than what they revealed. The image of a woman who understood how power could be drawn from perception. Messalina began to cultivate mystery. Her appearances became rarer, her words fewer, her gestures quieter. In a court where every man competed for attention, her restraint became magnetic. Senators waited for a glance, generals for a single approving smile. She learned that silence could command more obedience than a decree. Behind that silence, she watched and gathered information. She noticed who lingered after meetings, who avoided eye contact, who trembled when certain names were mentioned. Her attendants, loyal, invisible, and everywhere, began to record what they saw. A senator's debt, a general's secret lover, a merchant's bribe. Tiny, harmless details, or so they seemed. But together, they formed a web. Claudius, meanwhile, grew increasingly dependent on her counsel. His mind, sharp in history but clouded in politics, trusted the calm voice that soothed him after Senate disputes. Messalina never contradicted him in public. She didn't need to. Her real work happened in the spaces between meetings, in the pauses of conversation, in the moments when others forgot she was listening. And slowly, imperceptibly, Rome began to bend. Appointed officials owed their seats not to merit, but to her favor. Provincial governors sent gifts to the empress's household before they sent reports to the emperor. When disputes arose in the Senate, men looked not at Claudius, but at the woman beside him, the one whose expression decided whether they lived or fell. The transformation was quiet, elegant, and complete. The empire that had once been governed by law was now governed by fear of humiliation. But fear is a double-edged sword. The more Messalina controlled it, the more she needed it. She started to crave the hidden pulse of power that came from watching proud men falter. Not because she delighted in cruelty, but because, for the first time, she felt free. Freedom in Rome was a concept reserved for men. A woman's life, even an empress's, was dictated by duty, modesty, and silence. But Messalina had found a loophole. If virtue was her cage, then corruption could be her escape. Still, she was careful. The empress did not yet rebel openly. She tested the limits the way a musician tests strings before a symphony. She began to invite select senators and their wives to private gatherings. These were not orgies, as later history would sensationalize them, but carefully orchestrated affairs where masks of respectability slipped just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Wine loosened tongues. Secrets surfaced. People laughed too freely. Messalina never joined the laughter. She sat quietly, smiling faintly, as if above it all, yet her attendants memorized every confession. By morning, she knew who was vulnerable and how. Rome's elite began to sense it, but couldn't resist. Being invited to the Empress's inner circle was an honor one couldn't refuse, and a trap one couldn't escape. Those who declined her invitations found their fortunes fading mysteriously, their petitions ignored, their names absent from Claudius's decrees. In less than 2 years, Messalina had built what might be called an empire within the empire, one made not of armies but of secrets. Yet beneath her growing confidence, something darker stirred. She had proven she could manipulate others, but now she wanted to test the boundaries of herself. What could she do? What was she capable of? One night, unable to sleep, she stood on the palace balcony overlooking the flickering lights of the city. The sound of Rome at night was unlike any other. Distant music, laughter, arguments, the rumble of carts, the quiet sobs of those forgotten by power. And in that chaos, she felt connected, not as an empress, but as something primal, untamed, alive. Perhaps it was then that she decided to blur the line between the palace and the streets. Perhaps the rumors of her wandering into the Suburra began not from malice, but from truth, a truth born from her hunger to see how the other half of Rome lived, to feel what her golden cage denied her. The historian Tacitus would later describe her as a monster of vice. But imagine her not as a caricature, but as a woman standing at the pinnacle of civilization, staring into its abyss and daring to step closer. Every act of rebellion, however small, gave her a rush stronger than any crown. In those moments, Messalina began to understand something profound about Rome itself. Its beauty and its rot were inseparable. The empire's grandeur depended on its hypocrisy. The same senators who preached morality funded brothels. The same priests who condemned sin accepted bribes for absolution. She had simply decided to stop pretending. That decision, to live without pretending, was the spark that would ignite everything to come. From that night forward, Messalina's transformation accelerated. The young bride once offered to stabilize an empire had turned into its mirror, reflecting its corruption, magnifying its desire, embodying its contradictions. By the time dawn broke over the Tiber, Rome still looked the same. The temples still glowed. The legions still marched. But within the walls of the imperial palace, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The girl who was meant to be the empire's salvation was now its most dangerous secret. And soon, the world would see what happens when the mask of virtue finally falls. And what lies beneath is not chaos, but intentional, exquisite control. By the early 40s CE, the palace no longer felt like a seat of government. It had transformed into something else entirely, a theater of submission, where dignity was currency and shame the price of survival. Messalina, now in her late teens, had mastered the art of invisible control. To the public, she remained Rome's paragon of virtue, the loving wife of Claudius, the gentle mother of Britannicus and Octavia. But within the marbled corridors of the Palatine Hill, her name had become a whisper that could end careers. No one could pinpoint when the shift happened. Perhaps it began at one of Claudius's banquets, those sprawling affairs meant to project the empire's wealth. But gradually, the gatherings began to change. The laughter was too loud, the silences too long, and eyes darted nervously to see who was watching. Messalina sat at the emperor's right hand, serene as ever, but her gaze missed nothing. She knew which senator's hand trembled as he lifted his cup, which general flinched when a rival's name was mentioned. Her attendants, trained in discretion, recorded everything. Rome's most powerful men and women arrived at these feasts dressed in gold and left stripped of confidence. At first, the degradation was subtle, a misplaced jest, a friendly challenge that forced an official to drink beyond his limit. A harmless performance meant to honor the gods that somehow ended in laughter directed at the wrong man. Then came the tests of loyalty, intimate, invasive, and impossible to refuse. Claudius, distracted by policy and appeased by his wife's composure, saw only the surface, a court united in merriment. But beneath that surface, Messalina had turned pleasure into punishment and obedience into addiction. For her, it wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was about proof. Proof that the same men who ruled provinces, commanded legions, and spoke of honor would crumble at a whisper. That the real empire didn't lie in maps or armies, but in secrets, held tight. and traded quietly in the dark. She had discovered something no emperor before her had understood so clearly, that information is the purest form of power. It began with simple dossiers, lists of who owed whom, who loved whom, who feared whom. Her attendants compiled them like soldiers sharpening weapons. By the time Claudius signed a decree, Messalina already knew how each senator would vote. The Senate, once proud and defiant, grew silent. Men who had once boasted of their independence now nodded automatically, afraid to draw her gaze. Governors competed not to serve the emperor, but to stay in the empress's good graces. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, found their loyalties divided between duty and self-preservation. The more control she gained, the more extravagant her performances became. The banquets turned into pageants, scenes choreographed with the precision of tragedy. Silk draped every wall. Wine from Greece and Spain flowed endlessly. Musicians played until their fingers bled. The food itself was spectacle: roasted peacocks, honeyed figs, and exotic fruits brought at ruinous expense. But the true entertainment wasn't the feast. It was the humiliation that followed. Senators were invited to perform in mock plays, reciting verses that revealed their weaknesses. Generals were forced into absurd competitions, not of skill, but of submission. Aristocratic women, summoned by imperial decree, found themselves at the mercy of games that blurred the line between ceremony and coercion. To refuse an invitation from the empress was unthinkable. To attend was worse. One by one, Rome's elite became ensnared. Some tried to fight back, spreading whispers of their own. But those who dared soon found their secrets exposed, debts revealed, affairs uncovered, sons accused of treason. Messalina didn't need soldiers to destroy her enemies. She needed only their shame. Her villa near the Campus Martius became an extension of her court, a sanctuary of sin disguised as an aristocratic residence. There, she gathered nobles under false pretenses, to honor the gods, to celebrate harvests, to toast military victories. But the walls of that villa were lined with listeners. Everything was recorded, everything remembered. When morning came, the attendees left in silence, knowing that one wrong word, one careless gesture, might resurface months later, twisted into ruin. Historians would later call this period the Reign of Whispers. No decree announced it, no war was fought, and yet the empire's foundation began to quake. Rome's government, once a structure of laws and hierarchies, had become a network of fear, each thread woven by the empress's invisible hand. And still, Claudius trusted her. To him, she was a symbol of domestic harmony, his young wife, his beautiful consort, his stabilizing force. Perhaps he suspected her influence, but the thought of confronting it terrified him more than ignorance. He needed her, or rather, he needed the illusion of her loyalty to maintain his own. But within the palace walls, loyalty no longer existed. There was only dependency. Even those who despised Messalina found themselves unable to act against her. She had seen too much, heard too much, and remembered everything. To destroy her would be to destroy themselves. What made Messalina truly dangerous was not her intelligence or beauty. It was her understanding of human weakness. She didn't conquer men through force. She dismantled them with precision. She recognized their hunger for status, their terror of ridicule, their secret cravings for approval. She gave them all three, then took them away. And she did it all behind a smile. To the world outside, Rome continued as always. Temples filled with incense, soldiers drilled in perfect order, and merchants traded goods across the empire. But behind those rituals of stability, the ruling class lived in quiet panic. Every man who rose to speak in the Senate wondered who had heard what, who might be watching, and who held his secrets in their hands. The line between power and vulnerability had blurred completely. There were stories, whispered but never confirmed, of daughters taken to the palace under imperial invitation and returned days later with eyes that refused to meet their fathers. Of senators forced into spectacles they could never speak of. Of generals kneeling before the woman they had once called the jewel of Rome, unable to lift their heads. Each scandal reinforced her authority. Each silence deepened her control. Yet even Messalina began to feel the weight of what she'd built. The empire she ruled from the shadows was vast, but fragile. Every secret was a brick in a wall that could collapse at the slightest tremor. She began to realize that her web of shame had trapped her, too, that to maintain control, she could never stop tightening the threads. In the stillness of the night, surrounded by luxury, she sometimes stood alone, looking out toward the dark horizon of Rome. The city that once seemed infinite now felt small, suffocating. Every torchlight reminded her of the faces she had ruined. Every whisper in the corridors echoed her own name. And though she would never admit it, fear had begun to shift sides. The woman who had weaponized humiliation was starting to fear exposure herself, not of scandal, but of emptiness. Because what happens when the power you built on secrets becomes your own secret to keep? That question would soon consume her. But for now, the performance continued. The banquets glowed brighter. The laughter grew louder. And the empire, unaware it was already cracking, danced obediently to the rhythm of Rome's most dangerous mistress, the empress who ruled through silence, spectacle, and shame. The empire still looked unbreakable from the outside. The eagles of Rome flew proudly on every banner. Its armies still marched in rhythm across foreign lands, and its marble temples still shone under the Mediterranean sun. But inside the palace, behind the golden curtains and perfumed halls, fear had become the new law. Messalina had perfected her reign of silence. Her power was invisible, yet absolute. No one defied her, not because they admired her, but because they feared what she knew. Every senator, every general, every noble family lived under the same quiet terror, that the empress might speak their names aloud. Her greatest creation was not an army or a decree, but a system of control built entirely on secrets. It was efficient, elegant, and cruel. In a lavish villa near the Campus Martius, disguised as a home of leisure for visiting dignitaries, Messalina constructed what many later called the Invisible Court. The building glowed with beauty from the outside, but its walls hid something darker. Each room was a stage, each conversation a test. Nobles came expecting favor, flattery, and luxury. They left bound by shame they could never confess. Messalina had learned that blackmail was the purest form of loyalty. Unlike love, it did not fade. Unlike power, it did not depend on armies or votes. It was eternal. Once someone's dignity was taken, it could never be restored. She used this knowledge like a weapon. In the villa's private chambers, wine flowed endlessly. Servants, trained and loyal only to her, kept records of everything. Gestures, whispers, names. Every flicker of weakness was noted, every rumor cross-checked. Messalina's secretaries, working in silence behind closed doors, transformed these observations into dossiers thicker than scrolls of law. By dawn, the palace knew everything worth knowing. Who was sleeping with whom, who was gambling away family fortunes, who was planning betrayal, or even thinking about it. Governors were appointed not because they could govern, but because they could be controlled. A man with a secret was more useful than one with integrity. Soldiers were promoted based not on valor, but on silence. And senators, once the backbone of Roman honor, now bowed not to the emperor, but to the woman behind his throne. The irony was perfect. Messalina didn't have to threaten anyone. She only had to remind them that she remembered. But the deeper her control spread, the more isolated she became. Even her allies grew distant. They smiled, yes, but their smiles were brittle, their words too careful. Messalina had turned trust into currency, and currency into poison. Still, she could not stop. Power had become her addiction. Each new secret, each new humiliation, brought the same intoxicating rush, the feeling of being untouchable. And like all addictions, it demanded escalation. The gatherings at her villa evolved into something grander, stranger, darker. They were called festivals, ceremonies supposedly dedicated to Venus or Bacchus, but everyone knew they were performances of obedience. At first, they resembled traditional Roman banquets: wine, music, poetry, laughter. Then slowly, the rituals changed. The music softened, the laughter died, and the guests realized they were no longer celebrating. They were being watched, tested, judged. Messalina orchestrated these nights like a conductor guiding an orchestra of nerves. Each guest was placed with careful precision, rivals side by side, husbands opposite their wives, allies seated next to spies. Every word, every glance, became dangerous. The goal was never pleasure, it was exposure. Rome's most powerful men found themselves drawn into performances that stripped away their dignity. Women of noble blood were forced to compete for the empress's approval in acts that blurred the line between devotion and degradation. And when it was over, when the torches burned low and the guests stumbled home, each one carried a private terror that what had happened would not stay secret. Messalina did not need to remind them. The memory itself was enough. For the first time, whispers of revolt began to stir among the elites. But they were only whispers, because no one could trust anyone else. The Empress had made sure of that. Every possible conspirator was compromised. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's strongest military unit, was paralyzed. Many of its commanders owed their promotions to her. Others feared exposure of the favors they'd accepted. The empire's protectors were no longer protectors at all. They were prisoners of their own guilt. In the Senate, a strange paralysis took hold. Speeches were shorter, debates lifeless. Men who once thundered about justice and patriotism now murmured carefully rehearsed lines. The slightest hint of dissent could mean ruin, not from the emperor's wrath, but from the empress's silence. And while the government rotted, the people continued their daily lives, unaware that the empire's heart was already decaying. Bread still arrived. The game still played. Statues of the emperor still shone in the sun. But beneath that spectacle, the system that had governed Rome for centuries was corroding, replaced by one woman's web of humiliation. Still, there was something even more dangerous than the fear she inspired, the fascination. For some, Messalina was not a villain but a dark miracle, a woman who had risen in a man's world, who ruled without armies, who bent the Senate to her will without ever raising her voice. Even her enemies spoke of her brilliance in whispers. She rules through shame, one senator admitted, and we obey her willingly. But others began to see the cost. Families destroyed, legacies erased, generations of honor turned to dust in a single night. Rome had traded its moral spine for survival, and the trade was becoming unbearable. Among the soldiers, resentment grew. These were men who had bled for the empire, who had fought in Gaul, Africa, and Germania, only to return home to a city ruled by fear and rumor. They could endure war. They could endure pain. But humiliation, that was something no soldier could forgive. Rumors spread through the barracks like wildfire. Messalina had insulted their commanders, humiliated their comrades, turned the empire's heroes into pawns. For the first time, the whispers that had sustained her power began to turn against her. And Messalina felt it. The empress who once thrived on fear now sensed the current shifting. The silence around her, once a sign of submission, grew heavier, colder. Her servants bowed lower, but their eyes darted away. Her advisors spoke less, waiting for someone else to speak first. The machine she had built was beginning to malfunction, too perfect, too rigid, too dependent on secrecy. So she tightened her grip. Punishments grew harsher. The festivals became crueler. Those accused of disloyalty vanished overnight. Every act of rebellion, real or imagined, was crushed. But each execution only deepened the cracks. Because no empire, no matter how strong, can survive when everyone within it is afraid to speak. And in the heart of that silence, Rome began to lose itself. The woman who had once embodied virtue now embodied its opposite. The empire that had once conquered the world was now conquered by its own reflection. Messalina stood alone at the center of her creation, a throne built not from marble or gold, but from the quiet, suffocating weight of secrets. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. And it could not last. The same force that had made her untouchable would soon make her expendable. The same secrets that kept others silent would one day be turned against her. But for now, the Empress stood triumphant, the Queen of Fear, ruling an empire that still looked eternal, even as it quietly began to die. By the time the 40 CE drew to a close, Rome was a city divided not by class or wealth, but by fear. On the marble surface, everything seemed unchanged. The markets still thrived. Temples still echoed with chants to Jupiter and Mars, and Claudius still sat upon his throne, signing decrees written by men too terrified to look him in the eye. Yet beneath that fragile order, the empire's heart was beginning to rot. Whispers had become the empire's new language. What began as cautious gossip in the Suburra now echoed in the marble corridors of the Senate. Everyone knew someone who had been summoned to the Empress's villa and returned different. The details varied. A senator humiliated, a noble's daughter vanished, a soldier dismissed without explanation, but the fear was always the same. And fear, when spread too thin, begins to turn into anger. The soldiers were the first to feel it. They were the ones who had bled for Rome, who had marched through mud and blood to defend its borders. They had watched friends die on distant battlefields and believed their sacrifice gave them honor. But now, their honor was mocked in whispers. Tales of commanders stripped of dignity before the Empress and her guests, of proud men reduced to trembling actors in her cruel performances. For hardened warriors, humiliation was worse than death. Death could make a man immortal. Shame made him invisible. In the barracks, the discontent grew louder. The men spoke of Messalina in tones that would once have meant execution. Better to face the Germanic tribes, they said, than her invitations. Some swore they would refuse to serve any commander favored by her. Others prayed the emperor would open his eyes. But Claudius remained blind. To him, the empire was still stable, and his wife still loyal. He saw only what she wanted him to see: loyalty, order, devotion. She had mastered the art of presenting chaos as harmony. Yet even Messalina could sense that something was changing. The laughter at her banquets felt hollow now. The smiles that once hid submission had hardened into masks of survival. Her power, though vast, had become brittle. She could still make men obey, but not respect her. The empire had grown quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet before a storm. And deep inside, Messalina began to feel something she had never felt before: paranoia. Every glance seemed a threat. Every silence felt heavy. She ordered her guards to double their watch, her servants to report any suspicious behavior, her attendants to track even the faintest whisper. But the more she searched for betrayal, the more enemies she imagined. The machinery of her fear turned inward. Her punishments grew crueler. Those accused of disloyalty were not merely dismissed, they disappeared. Families were broken. Fortunes seized. Whole lineages erased from the city's memory. And yet, the tighter she gripped, the faster loyalty slipped through her fingers. Rome was no longer ruled by the emperor or the Senate. It was ruled by exhaustion. People obeyed because rebellion required energy, and the empire was too tired to fight. But fatigue is dangerous. It dulls fear. And in the dullness of fear, courage begins to bloom. It started with whispers among the Praetorian officers. Men who once protected her, now whispering about her downfall. They spoke quietly, behind locked doors, careful even with their own shadows. They did not yet plan an uprising, but they dreamed of a Rome without her. The nobles, too, began to drift away. Messalina's villa, once overflowing with eager guests, grew emptier. Invitations that once inspired excitement now inspired dread. Excuses multiplied: illness, travel, religious duty. The empire's elite had finally realized that proximity to the empress was not privilege, it was poison. Even the Senate began to stir. Claudius's freedmen, his closest advisors, men who had once risen from slavery to power, started whispering to the emperor, gently, cautiously. They spoke of instability, of scandals, of the growing murmur among the legions. They never accused her directly. That would have been suicide, but they planted seeds. And those seeds began to take root. For the first time, Claudius hesitated before signing her petitions. For the first time, he asked questions. Why do these rumors persist? He wondered aloud. Why do my generals avoid the palace? Messalina heard of his doubts and panicked. She ordered grander feasts, more elaborate festivals, attempts to prove that the empire still adored her. But the extravagance only deepened the resentment. The people saw abundance in the palace while famine touched the provinces. Soldiers saw gold squandered on performances while pay was delayed. The illusion of control was slipping. One night, as she walked through her villa, torches flickering, marble reflecting her footsteps, Messalina paused. For years she had ruled through fear. Now, for the first time, she feared her own creation. She looked into a bronze mirror, polished, so bright she could see every detail of her face. The reflection was beautiful, but strange, her eyes colder, her mouth tighter. She no longer recognized herself. Is this power? She whispered. Or am I already its prisoner? But the question came too late. Her courtiers began to defect quietly. Some fled to the provinces. Others pledged loyalty to Claudius's freedmen. Rumors spread that the emperor was finally listening, that he was gathering evidence. Messalina responded the only way she knew how, with intimidation. She summoned those who doubted her, forced confessions, staged punishments. But every execution only made her more isolated. It was no longer Rome that feared her. It was Messalina who feared Rome. Even her own guards whispered that her downfall was inevitable. The Praetorians, once symbols of imperial strength, had turned indifferent. They would follow orders. Yes, but whose orders? No one could say. The air in the palace grew colder, heavier. Even the servants, once loyal to the core, began to move more quietly, avoiding her gaze. It was as if the empire itself had started holding its breath. And yet, outwardly, everything still gleamed. Statues were polished, flowers were placed daily, the empire's image maintained. The theater of Rome had not ended. It had simply changed acts. Behind every wall, behind every whisper, the unspoken question lingered. How long could this continue? Because even the most powerful weapon, fear, has an expiration. Once people stop believing it can hurt them, it turns to dust. Messalina did not yet know it, but she had crossed that invisible line. Her enemies were no longer hiding. They were waiting, watching, and somewhere among them, the first spark of revolt had already been lit. Soon, it would ignite into something even she couldn't control, not a rebellion of armies, but of betrayal. A quiet, precise vengeance born not from hate, but from exhaustion. The empress who once enslaved Rome through silence was about to discover that silence can also bury the powerful. In the final months of her reign, as she sat surrounded by gold, wine, and trembling courtiers, Messalina could still command obedience. But it was an obedience hollowed out from within, the kind that exists not because people fear death, but because they are waiting to see who will strike first. And when that moment came, it would not be loud. It would begin, as it always had for her, with a whisper. The moment that destroyed Messalina's empire did not arrive as an ambush in the night or a knife in the dark. It came in daylight, bright, public, and ceremonial, with garlands of flowers, music, priests, and applause. It came as a wedding. It was the year 48 CE. Claudius had left Rome for Ostia to inspect construction at the port, accompanied by his advisors and guards. The empire was at peace, or so it seemed. The city moved in rhythm, markets busy, temples full, the Senate pretending to govern. Messalina remained in the palace, unchallenged, untouchable, until she decided to do the unthinkable. For years, she had lived in contradiction, adored in daylight, feared in darkness. Her power had been absolute, but invisible, and now, perhaps intoxicated by that power, or by the illusion that she could do no wrong, she chose to bring her secret world into the light. Her lover was Gaius Silius, a handsome and ambitious senator, young enough to still believe he could outwit fate. Silius had long been part of her circle, charming, loyal, and daring. He had seen the empires rot and believed that together they could rule in truth, not shadows. Maybe he loved her. Maybe he simply craved what she represented, the throne itself. Their relationship was known in whispers, ignored out of fear. But in the autumn of that year, Messalina crossed the final line that no one, not even an emperor's wife, could cross. While Claudius was away, she ordered preparations for a real marriage. Not a tryst, not a ritual in secret. A full Roman wedding, public, legal, witnessed by priests, senators, and courtiers. The torches were lit, musicians summoned, and invitations sent out. Rome, long accustomed to scandal, stood stunned. In the gardens of the Palatine, Messalina appeared dressed in white silk threaded with gold. The priest raised his hand, invoking the gods to bless the union. Silius took her hand and repeated the vows that every Roman knew by heart. Vows reserved for one man and one woman, never for an empress whose husband still lived. When the ceremony ended, the crowd remained silent, frozen between awe and terror. Messalina smiled as if she had just rewritten the laws of the empire. To her, it was more than love. It was a declaration that she, not Claudius, ruled Rome. That her web of loyalty and shame had made her so powerful that even open treason could not touch her. But that illusion lasted only days. The news reached Claudius almost by accident. One of his freedmen, Narcissus, a man both cunning and loyal, brought him word of a strange celebration in the palace. At first, the emperor laughed. "Impossible," he said. "Messalina is my wife. She has given me heirs." He dismissed it as gossip. But the evidence kept coming. Witnesses, documents, even priests who had officiated the wedding confirmed it. Slowly, the laughter drained from his face. Claudius, mocked for his indecision all his life, now faced the ultimate humiliation. His wife had married another man, not in secret, but in daylight, with Rome as witness. His authority, his manhood, his rule, all had been turned into spectacle. When realization finally struck, it did not come with rage, but with cold, methodical clarity. He summoned the Praetorian Guard. He ordered Narcissus to lead them back to Rome. "Bring her to me," he said. The empress who had ruled through fear was about to learn what fear truly meant. When the soldiers arrived, Messalina was still in her gardens. The flowers she had planted for her wedding were still fresh. She was laughing with friends, perhaps believing even now that her influence would save her. Then she saw the armor glinting in the sunlight and understood. Witnesses later said her expression changed instantly, from confidence to calculation to despair. She begged to speak to Claudius, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. She sent messengers racing to the emperor's camp, carrying desperate letters written in her own hand, calling on his forgiveness, his affection, his memories of their children. But the emperor never saw them. Narcissus intercepted everything. He knew that if Claudius saw her again, he might forgive her, and that forgiveness would destroy Rome. So he acted. Messalina was confined in the gardens that had once been her kingdom. The walls were high, the gates sealed. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and blood. Outside, the guards waited, silent and uneasy. Inside, the empress paced like a caged lioness. She sent for her children, for priests, for mercy, but none came. Claudius remained away, indecisive, perhaps grieving, or perhaps relieved. As the hours passed, panic began to set in. Messalina, once the master of secrets, now found herself without allies, without control. Every name she had used, every loyalty she had bought, had turned to dust. When the soldiers entered to deliver the order, death by her own hand, she tried to face it with the same poise she had shown in life. But courage built on control is fragile. The dagger shook in her hand. Her attendants wept. One of them urged her to act quickly, to preserve a fragment of dignity. But she couldn't. The woman who had ruled Rome through fear could not face the fear of herself. Finally, the captain of the guard stepped forward. His blade flashed once in the sunlight, and it was over. The Empress of Rome fell to the ground among her own roses, a crimson stain blooming across white silk. Narcissus ordered the body left where it fell until Claudius returned. When the emperor saw her corpse, he did not speak. He simply turned away. The man who had been manipulated, humiliated, and deceived had no words left for the woman who had made him both powerful and powerless. In the days that followed, Claudius issued a single command. Her statues were to be torn down, her name erased from inscriptions, her memory condemned. Damnatio memoriae, the Roman curse of oblivion. Stone by stone, image by image, Messalina was erased from Rome. But erasure is not the same as forgetting. The story of her downfall spread faster than any decree. Some called it justice, others tragedy. Many whispered that even in death, she had won, for she had revealed what Rome truly was, a kingdom of hypocrisy, built on the fear of shame. In the gardens where she died, the roses kept blooming, season after season. Visitors would pause, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, and wonder if the empress's spirit lingered there, still watching, still remembering. And so the legend survived, long after her name was chiseled from stone. Messalina's end was not simply the death of a woman. It was the death of an illusion. That virtue could rule Rome, that fear could hold forever, that power built on humiliation could ever stand unchallenged. For in the end, the empress who had ruled through shame died the same way she had lived, surrounded by beauty, undone by secrets, and consumed by the very silence she had once commanded. The execution was over. The air in the imperial gardens hung thick with the scent of iron and roses. Messalina, The empress who had ruled through whispers lay still among the flowers she once used to decorate her deceit. The soldiers, silent and uneasy, withdrew one by one, leaving only the faint echo of armor clinking against marble. Rome had rid itself of its most dangerous woman. But Rome had also lost its reflection. When Claudius returned to the palace, the silence was suffocating. No servants rushed to greet him. No laughter filled the corridors. He walked past the courtyard where his wife had once welcomed foreign envoys with perfect grace. Now it was empty. The emperor stopped before a statue, her likeness in white marble, serene and eternal. For a long moment he stared. Then, with a quiet gesture, he ordered it destroyed. What followed was one of the most merciless acts of erasure in Roman history, damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Every image of Messalina was to be chiseled from stone, her name struck from public records, her likeness melted down from bronze busts, her portraits painted over, her inscriptions defaced. It was as if Rome itself had decided that forgetting her was more important than killing her. But the irony was cruel. The more they tried to erase her, the more her story spread. Artisans who carved her face from marble whispered her name in secret. Servants tasked with burning her letters read them first, captivated by the voice that had once ruled an empire. Poets, forbidden to speak of her, wove her into their verses under the guise of allegory. Even among the senators who had once bowed in terror, her ghost lingered. They would wake in the night, heart pounding, certain that someone had whispered her name behind them. Rome's moralists called it justice. Historians called it purification. But no amount of destruction could undo the truth that Messalina had revealed, that the empire's greatest enemy was not foreign, but human. Under Claudius's reign, public life resumed its ritual of order. The Senate met again, soldiers drilled, and temples reopened with fresh offerings to the gods. But something invisible had changed. The laughter in the forum was more brittle, the voices more careful. No one trusted anyone. The fear that Messalina had sown had not died with her. It had simply become part of Rome's bloodstream. For Claudius, the loss was deeper than humiliation. He had believed her to be his redemption, his proof that he, mocked as weak and hesitant, could rule through virtue and lineage. Her betrayal broke something in him that would never mend. Those closest to him said that after Messalina's death, the emperor aged years and weeks. His stammer worsened, his gaze seemed lost. At banquets, he often looked toward the empty seat beside him, as if expecting her to appear again, smiling, deceitful, alive. In private, he never spoke her name. But the empire couldn't stop. Her legend grew, twisted, reshaped with every retelling. To some, she was the embodiment of vice, the courtesan who corrupted a dynasty, the seductress who nearly toppled the empire with her lust. To others, she was something more complex. A woman born into a cage of virtue who dared to use the only weapon allowed to her, knowledge. The truth, as always, was buried beneath both myth and malice. As the years passed, Messalina became a mirror in which Rome saw itself, its beauty and its decay, its greatness and its rot. Artists began to paint her again, not as a villain but as a warning. Philosophers cited her as proof that moral collapse begins in the heart, not the battlefield. And ordinary Romans, passing the ruins of her villa near the Campus Martius, whispered that at night, one could still hear laughter, faint, mocking, echoing through the marble halls. In the ruins of her destroyed gardens, roses continued to bloom. Each spring, their scent drifted through the air, impossible to suppress, impossible to erase, just like her memory. It was as if Rome itself refused to forget her. And perhaps it couldn't. Because Messalina's story was more than scandal. It was prophecy. She had shown that the empire's foundation, its laws, its pride, its virtue, was only as strong as the people upholding it. She had proved that power could be built not with swords but with secrets, that fear could govern as effectively as armies. And in doing so, she left Rome with a mirror it could never look away from. The Senate could crush her name, but not her lesson. Empires do not fall when enemies invade. One philosopher wrote years later. They fall when they lose the courage to face their own corruption. In the generations that followed, emperors would rise and fall, each swearing to restore Rome's purity, but each repeating, in some form, the same pattern Messalina had set. Behind every throne, a whisper. Behind every law, a secret. Behind every ruler, a shadow. Even centuries later, her legend endured. Medieval chroniclers described her as a demon in human form. Renaissance painters revived her as a tragic heroine, beautiful, cunning, doomed. Modern historians still argue over who she really was, a victim, a monster, or a woman too intelligent for the world she was born into. And through it all, one truth remains. Messalina outlived the empire that tried to forget her. Her story became eternal not because it was glorious, but because it was true, a warning carved into history's foundation stones. When you walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill today, the air still carries the weight of her absence. The mosaics gleam faintly in the sun, the marble floors cracked but enduring. Tourists marvel at the architecture, unaware that beneath their feet lie the remnants of her garden, the place where Rome's most feared empress took her last breath. Listen closely, and the silence seems to hum. It's not just the wind between the stones. It's memory, persistent, forbidden, alive. Messalina may have died young, but the empire she exposed lived on in her image, proud, fragile, terrified of its own desires. History remembers her not because Rome wanted to, but because it couldn't stop. She became the ghost that every tyrant fears, the embodiment of what happens when fear replaces justice, when power forgets morality, when truth becomes too dangerous to speak. And in that way, she won the only immortality Rome could never revoke. For as long as people whisper in corridors, hide their shame, and hunger for control, Messalina will never be forgotten. Centuries passed, and yet the story of Messalina refused to die. Her name, once chiseled out of marble, whispered again through history's corridors, first as gossip, then as caution, and finally as legend. Every empire that rose after Rome found itself looking into her reflection, seeing in her downfall the prophecy of its own. What remained of her world? The mosaics, the crumbling walls, the sunlit ruins of the Palatine, became monuments not to her crimes, but to Rome's fragility. The same empire that had conquered continents had been brought to its knees not by invasion, not by fire, but by corruption that began in a single heart and spread like smoke through marble halls. Messalina's life was not just scandal, it was anatomy, the dissection of power itself. For centuries, historians argued about who she truly was. Ancient chroniclers, mostly men, painted her as a monster, insatiable, manipulative, driven by lust and cruelty. They needed her to be evil, because to admit otherwise was to admit that Rome's greatness had been undone by something far more human: fear, loneliness, and desire. But time has a way of softening even the harshest stories. Modern scholars looked again at the fragments, at her age when she was married, at the restrictions that bound her, at the political machinery she lived inside, and they saw not just a seductress, but a woman trapped in the performance of power. A 15-year-old turned into a symbol, used to sanctify an emperor, crushed when she became too real to control. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the myths, between the marble goddess and the monster of lust, because Messalina was both. She was a victim of her time and its greatest student. She didn't create Rome's corruption. She learned to survive in it, and then she mastered it. And that is what terrified them most. For Rome, her story became a mirror, the kind that every civilization fears to look into. Because in her reflection, the empire saw its own vices magnified, greed disguised as virtue, control masked as order, silence mistaken for peace. The greatest irony of her life was that she never sought to destroy Rome. She merely revealed what it already was. After her death, Rome tried to move on. But the moral foundation she had shattered could not be rebuilt. The same senators who condemned her later indulged in excesses of their own. Future emperors, Nero, Commodus, Elagabalus, would prove that the sickness Messalina embodied had outlived her. Each of them would, in their own way, turn shame into spectacle, vice into theater. What she began as manipulation became policy. What she used as survival became governance. Rome, like all great powers, learned nothing. And perhaps that is the real tragedy. Not that Messalina lived, but that she was necessary. That an empire so obsessed with perfection required imperfection to function, that its public morality depended on private hypocrisy, that every vow of virtue concealed the machinery of exploitation. Her fall should have been a lesson. Instead, it became a warning ignored. Today, if you stand among the ruins of the Palatine Hill, you can still feel her shadow. The stones are warm under the sun, but the air carries a chill, as if the past is exhaling. Tourists walk with cameras, historians scribble notes, and guides recite the same old script. Here lived Claudius. Here ruled Messalina. But the truth lingers in silence, in the spaces between the words. You can almost imagine her, not as a villain, not as a saint, but as a human being, standing on a balcony above the city, gazing at the horizon she helped darken. The wind lifting her hair, the city sprawling beneath her, unaware that its fate was already written. She must have known, even then, that power built on fear cannot last, that every secret, once spoken, becomes a weapon, that every empire that learns to live with shame will one day drown in it. The marble that bore her face has crumbled, but her story endures because it tells us something timeless, that the collapse of morality begins quietly, not with rebellion, but with compromise. Messalina's Rome was not destroyed by passion. It was destroyed by silence, by men who knew the truth but chose not to speak it, by senators who bowed to survive, by citizens who pretended not to see, by a ruler who preferred illusion to confrontation. And isn't that how every empire falls? Not with fire and sword, but with the slow corrosion of truth. Her death, in the garden, among the roses, was not just her punishment. It was Rome's confession. The empire had killed her, but in doing so, it admitted that it had become everything she represented. 2,000 years later, her name still echoes because the world never stopped building empires, not of marble, but of money, image, and control. Each new civilization repeats her story in its own way, power masquerading as virtue, influence traded for silence, and shame weaponized as authority. And just like in Rome, we look away until it's too late. The tale of Messalina is not a relic, it's a reflection. Every age that believes itself too civilized to fall is already standing on the same precipice. Every nation that thinks its laws can outlast its morals is already cracking from within. That's why her ghost lingers, not to haunt, but to remind. The ruin of Rome was not her doing alone. It was the inevitable result of a system that prized image over integrity, obedience over courage, and spectacle over truth. She merely held up the mirror. The empire shattered itself upon it. When night falls over the Palatine, the city lights shimmer on the Tiber like a trail of molten gold. The wind carries faint sounds, laughter, footsteps, whispers, that could belong to anyone or to her. And in that light, fleeting but eternal, one understands why her name survived every attempt to erase it. Because Rome, for all its grandeur, could never kill what she represented. The seductive, terrifying truth that the mightiest civilizations do not end in conquest. They collapse in their own reflection. In the end, Messalina's story is not about her lust or her cruelty. It is about Rome's. It's about how power, when left unexamined, becomes its own disease. She died as a symbol of disgrace. But history has reimagined her as something else, a lesson carved in marble and blood, echoing through time. Empires do not fall from without. They crumble from the rot within. And so, centuries later, her shadow still walks through the ruins, not in vengeance, but in warning. Every civilization that rises believes it is eternal. Every empire thinks it has mastered morality. But every empire, at its peak, begins to rot. Messalina knew it. Rome learned it too late. And now, standing among the ruins, the world must decide. Will it listen? The ruins of Rome stand silent, but they are not still. The marble breathes. The shadows remember. In the evening light, when the sun sinks behind the Tiber and the air grows heavy with dust and history, it almost feels as if the stones are whispering. And if you listen long enough, you can still hear her name, Messalina. 2,000 years have passed, yet her story has never faded. It lingers not because Rome preserved it, but because it couldn't destroy it. For all its armies, temples, and gods, the empire never found a way to silence the truth buried within her legend. That power corrupts not through conquest, but through fear, secrecy, and silence. In the centuries that followed her death, the world tried to turn her into a myth, a warning, a weapon, a mirror. Each era reshaped her in its own image. To the Middle Ages, she was the embodiment of sin. To the Renaissance, she was beauty unrestrained. To modern history, she is the question no civilization dares to answer. What happens when the system itself becomes complicit in its own corruption? Walk through the Palatine ruins today and you can trace the shape of her world. The marble corridors where senators once trembled, the gardens where her laughter echoed, the villa where she faced her final hour. The air hums with ghosts, and in their silence lies the most enduring lesson of all. No empire, no institution, no power is immune to the rot that begins within. Messalina's fall was not the fall of a woman. It was the exposure of a system. She was both symptom and spark, both creation and destroyer of the very Rome she served. The empire that prided itself on law, virtue, and reason collapsed not from invasion, but from the infection of its own hypocrisy. And isn't that the cycle of history? Every age believes itself immune. Every civilization imagines its marble will outlast its morals. But power, unchecked, is the oldest poison of all. Messalina's story endures because it is the story of us. We build systems of order, dress them in righteousness, and call them eternal. We write laws and codes, swear oaths, build temples to integrity. Yet somewhere in the machinery, a whisper begins, the whisper of ambition, of fear, of compromise. It starts quietly, one secret, one lie, one silence. And like Rome, we convince ourselves it's harmless, until it's not. Messalina understood the psychology of fear better than any emperor or general. She discovered that control did not require swords, only secrets. And once she saw how easily men surrendered to their own shame, she never stopped using it. Her empire was built not on strength, but on the fragility of others. That is why her story remains so haunting, because it exposes something eternal in the human condition. Our weakness isn't lust, or greed, or pride. It's the need to be seen as good while doing what we know is wrong. Messalina didn't invent that paradox. She weaponized it. In her downfall, we see the warning repeated across ages, from Rome's marble to the glass towers of modern power. The settings change, but the script remains, a system built on fear, a ruler convinced of invincibility, a society too complicit to speak. Rome burned centuries after her death, but the spark had been lit long before, in every secret whispered in her chambers, in every silence that traded morality for survival. History teaches, but it also forgets. The same empires that once condemned her later repeated her sins. The same institutions that swore to preserve virtue crumbled under the weight of their own lies. And each time, humanity swore it had learned. Yet the pattern continues. Every time truth is buried to protect power, every time shame becomes a weapon, every time silence is mistaken for peace, Messalina's shadow walks among us again. And perhaps that is why her name endures, carved not in stone but in consequence. She is not just a figure of history. She is a warning made flesh. Her empire fell, but her lesson is immortal. Even now, as the modern world builds its digital palaces, its invisible empires of influence and fear, the ghost of Rome stirs beneath the surface. The tools are new, the screens, the scandals, the politics, but the mechanics are ancient. The seduction of control, the intoxication of image, the fragility of virtue when tested by desire. Messalina's story asks a question that no civilization has ever truly answered. Can power exist without corruption? Can greatness survive without truth? Standing on the Palatine Hill, the city below glows in twilight. Ancient ruins beside neon lights, the past and present coexisting in one vast reflection. The air tastes of dust, wine, and eternity. Somewhere, a single rose blooms between cracks in the marble, its color impossibly vivid against the gray stone. It's hard not to imagine her there, not as the empress of scandal, but as the ghost of consequence. Watching, waiting, whispering, because that is what history is, not memory, but repetition. And so, as night falls, the ruins of Rome fade into silhouette. The tourists leave, the torches dim, and the city hums with the same quiet pulse that once ran through its empire. the pulse of power and fear, of beauty and decay. The camera would linger on the broken statues, the fallen columns, the gardens where she once walked. The music would soften, ancient and haunting, the kind that feels like memory breathing. And then, slowly, it would fade to black, leaving only her voice, not as accusation, but as truth. Empires die not when enemies break their gates, but when their people forget why they built them. That is the echo of Messalina. Not her cruelty, not her lust, but her revelation. She showed the world that even marble can rot, that even gods can fall, that even perfection, the illusion Rome worshipped, can turn to dust. And so she endures, not as the villain history painted, nor as the saint revisionists sought to redeem, but as the eternal whisper reminding us what power truly means. It is not conquest. It is not rule. It is not glory. It is responsibility, the burden of seeing oneself clearly, of ruling not through fear, but through truth. Rome forgot that lesson, and that is why it fell. The ruins remain, and in them, so does she. The girl who became empress, the empress who became myth, the myth that became a mirror. Her story ends where every empire's story ends, in silence. But silence, as Rome learned too late, never means peace. Sometimes, silence is just the sound of history waiting to repeat itself.